It's very unclear what the future in Ukraine is going to be. Uh, when it started, just under a year ago, Mr. Putin gained as much territory as he was likely to gain. All his wins took place then. What achievements he's made in the last year have been made effectively by the brutal mercenaries of Prigozhin, have been made by crooks, by thieves, by rapists, by murderers, by fraudsters, people from prison. Are these the heroes that any country can ever celebrate? So that's the background. And when the conflict began, when it was quite clear that Kyiv was not going to capitulate, it became a race between two people. Who was going to win this race? Vladimir Putin or Vladimir Zelensky? And Putin, in response, has retreated to the USSR handbook of how to fight a war. It's textbook. And the Russians would say that they've seen it all before. And the Russian propaganda has built up this idea, as we've seen in some of the comments that have been posted under my YouTubes, that Russia has never lost a war. This is completely false. It flies in the face of the facts. All we have to do is do a very brief survey of the various conflicts in which Russia has been engaged in literally the last 100 years. And most of them, if Russia has won them, it's been a sort of Pyrrhic victory. But most of the time, Russia has not won. Russia has retreated. The first Chechen War, for example, between 1994 to 1996, failure. The Eritrean Command, the Eritrean War of Independence, failure, 1991. The Russian retreat from Afghanistan, 1989, after 10 years. But in fact, that wasn't the first Russian war in Afghanistan. There was another one in 1929, failure. In 1926, failure. The Vlora incident in 1968, failure. The Winter War, we can go back to the Second World War. Russia goes on and on and on about how successful it was in the Second World War, how it won the Second World War. Well, it didn't win the war in Finland in 1940. And before the Second World War, the Soviet invasion of Xinjiang in 1934, failure. We can go back to the formation of the Soviet Union itself, back to the Soviet-Polish War, failure, 1921. The Finnish War, the Lithuanian War, 1919, the Latvian War, the Estonian War of Independence that ended in the Tartu Peace Treaty in 1920. All of them, failure, 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 failure by the Russian state. It's a fiction put out by Kremlin propagandists that Russia always wins. Russia generally fails. The Russian success rate is poor. But it is true that Russia can harness a huge number of human resources, a huge country with thousands of potential soldiers, cannon fodder, all poorly equipped, all poorly trained, cannon fodder. The sheer human numbers might tip the balance in favor of the Kremlin, might keep up the action until Putin wins the next election, because surely that's the only reason that Putin went into Ukraine, to look strong before the next election. And I strongly predict that Putin will hold off any form of retreat until after he is firmly elected president again for the next period, or dies. And then I think there's an option for a negotiated settlement, and indeed for a full retreat. He will have achieved all he intended to achieve, which is to remain in power. So The Ukraine campaign is to secure a Putin victory. It was a PR blast that went badly wrong, and now it's about battening down the hatches and avoiding any retreat in the foreseeable future. And for that, Putin, I'm sure, is ready to use the expendable manpower from across the whole of the Russian territory, and particularly from those villages and those small towns that are as far away from Moscow, as far away from the body bags on television as he can possibly get. And don't forget, of course, the refrigerated vans of Prigozhin. Don't forget Prigozhin at all, because Prigozhin may be pushed into the background today, but Prigozhin is needed by Putin. Putin fully recognizes that Prigozhin's men cannot be tomorrow's heroes. They cannot. It's not possible to celebrate the victories of rapists and murderers, thieves and frauds who've emerged from prison to butcher, to fight the Ukrainians. It's not possible to celebrate the rain of missiles indiscriminately thrown at civilian sites. And it's not possible to celebrate the children abducted from Ukraine, the soldiers and medics tortured in Ukraine, the civilians blindfolded and executed in Ukraine. But all this brutality, rather than securing the future of Russia, builds up a sense of the new determination, the new national identity of an emerging and strong Ukraine. It builds up the requests of neighbouring states to join NATO. It has the opposite effect of establishing the security for Russia. It weakens Russia. It strengthens the premiership and the status, the international status of President Zelensky. And Putin is trapped in his own electoral gamble and up his own propaganda, depleting his arsenal of weapons, demoting or imprisoning any general that questions his war aims, presiding over the biggest exodus of working-aged men in Russian modern history. If Putin's plans were to secure the Russian-speaking world as one unit, to build a bridge to eastern Moldova, Transnistria, it's unlikely now. The best that can be hoped for is a fragile ceasefire, like the armistice that followed the signing of the Versailles Treaty, the 20-year armistice that then led to the outbreak of World War II. The best that can be hoped for is that, for Putin. Because Ukraine is not going to concede any territory after suffering so many deaths, so many pointless deaths. And we have to ask what we are doing. Are we simply helping Ukraine to defend itself? That is, I think, our moral duty. But are we, I think the West is now divided into two. The USA would probably say that we are doing exactly that. We are helping to defend Ukraine. But Poland, maybe Britain, would say that we are probably trying to stop the Russian advance. That's a slightly different thing. We're trying to break the Russian military machine advancing into Ukraine. That's different to defending Ukraine. It's becoming slightly more active, and we have to be very, very careful that what we are proposing doesn't involve any form of action against Russia itself. because that's where the Russian propaganda machine is heading. The Russian propaganda machine says that Poland has already invaded Ukraine and that Russia's troops are there to support Russia. Russia's propaganda is already saying that NATO is threatening the security of Moscow. This is untrue. As far as I know, this is untrue. Even that qualification is worrying. This is untrue. I say it without qualification. We have three jobs. Number one, to support the defense of Ukraine. Number two, to counter the propaganda that is spread across Russia. And number three, to negotiate a proper and a lasting peace between Ukraine and Russia, between Russia and the rest of the world, to ensure that Russia can be brought back into the international family, and that ordinary Russians can respectfully hold up their faces in public. That may involve a negotiation for Mr. Putin's retirement. It may not. But at the moment, Putin is heading towards evil from which he may not be able to retreat. We need to be ready to talk to Putin before we get to that point. I think possibly we've been on the edge of that for some time. What Putin is doing is evil. Whether he himself is evil is another matter. I think he can be pulled back. I hope he can. I have ultimate hope in the goodness of individuals, but whether or not that's possible, who knows? And people have said on this site, people have said in the comments that we didn't negotiate with Hitler. Of course we did, and we continue to keep channels open, even when we were fighting. We seem to have closed a lot of these channels with Putin. We need to have them open. We need to have that dialogue, because I don't think we've got that far. And more than that, in the Second World War, we were at war with Hitler. We are not at war with Russia or with Putin. Ukraine is at war. We are not. We need to be negotiating until that point comes when maybe we might be at war, but I hope we will not get to that point. We need to be talking, even if Ukraine cannot.